Welcome to the next lesson. Today we are going to be going into CSS 7 layouts, positioning with CSS. So make your way over to lennyroycodes.glitch.me and enter lesson 7, where we can take a look at our PDF as we always do. Let's see, we're going to have HTML code written for us again. We're going to have layouts or stylings written for us again. We're going to be making changes and commenting things to see those changes. But really what we're going to look at is 3 distinct ways to lay out things in CSS. Hopefully going into more detail later on. But a lot of these early HTML CSS lessons are about just exposing you to these things and hoping that you would do more research on your own and rewatching the videos and gathering more as you go along. But in this case, for this lesson, we will be messing around with a fixed setting. Looks like something we're calling sticky. It's a class called sticky. Changing top properties, left properties, positioning things absolutely. Floats, not my favorite, but we'll look into that too. Clearing things while using floats. And then finally messing around with a couple of built-in bootstrap settings and seeing how those columns change based on some things we're going to do. So we're going to do a lot of experimenting. We're going to break things apart a little bit and go into more detail with these CSS items in a future series or a future lesson. Haven't decided quite yet. So let's get started. We are going to click right into the glitch template and make a remix copy, rename our copy, and then get started with the first part. So we'll see that our first instruction is called positioning elements with CSS, and it's directing us to go into the index HTML and hold on. We are going to remove the comments from section lines 22 to 26. Now, some of those numbers might not be correct by the time you see this, so look for this div class of relative and uncomment down here for this div class of absolute. So we just want this area uncommented. And we see 4 divs, each with a different class name. Everything else is commented out in our CSS. Body height 1000. Got a lot of stuff going on here, but we're going to look at it one by one. Let's take a look at how our site looks now. Okay, we see kind of a mess. Relative, sticky, fixed, absolute, a couple of colors. Don't worry about this now. I'll tell you exactly where to go. The next part of the lesson is to modify in the fixed class in the styles.css section. So you've uncommented this area here. You're good to go for the first part. Now it's directing you to the styles.css. And in here we're looking for fixed class. Remember, classes have the period before them and not the hashtag. That's how we know they're classes. These all appear to be classes, but none of them say fixed. Absolute fixed right here. And we are changing the top property from whatever it is to 50px. We see here that it is currently 0px. So first I just want to take a look. Which one of these is the fixed property? Looks like it's the one that says fixed over there to the right. And you see how it now has a red background. Let's remove that styling. And we'll do what the first instruction says, which is to add a top property of 50px. And I believe that's going to push it down. So let's just take a look. And we see that our fixed moved down. It's being covered by the fish, so I'm actually going to change that to 150. And we see that our fixed moved down by 150. Yeah, it says in the instructions, you'll notice that the div name fixed is now lower from the top. Now add the following to that same declaration, right 20%. So we're adding right 20% instead of 30px to the fixed declaration. Let's see, 20%, and I guess it's gonna move 20% of the width of the page from the right, so it's gonna be pushed from here over here. Let's see, and yep, it was pushed over. Wonder what happens when you do 90%. Does it leave a little bit of space on the left? It does. Change that back to 20. And we're doing pretty good. We're learning how to use our top and right properties in CSS. It's a jail-free card, I call it, right? So we have margins right and left and padding and flexbox and lots of different ways to get our elements to be exactly where we want them to be on the page. But sometimes we can't get it quite right and we need to rely on these properties, the top, left, right, and bottom to just give a little bit more room and to explicitly change an element's position using those elements. So, or using those properties. The next part of this lesson is in the sticky class declaration. So we're moving out of fixed and we're going to go to sticky, where we will add, we'll change the top property from whatever it is to 10. Right now it's at 0, so we'll change it to 10. What happened? Sticky class from 0 to 10. Hold on, let's make that 100. And see if we can see the sticky class drop more. Ah, yeah, there it is. So you saw it dropped a little bit right there. Change that back to 10. Ah, and what was it before? Was it covering before? If it was at 0, let's see. I guess it can't be brought up anymore because of the block element up here. Interesting that the fixed one was up there though. Let's change that to 10 as the instructions ask for. And in the absolute class declaration, where's our absolute? We are going to change the top property to 200px. So right now it's 100px. Change it to 2. We saw that it got pushed down. We're going to add a left of 50px. Hold on, let me see. One thing I have to do real quick so I make sure I don't mess this up for later. So in CSS, the bottommost property is what's going to take precedence. So I'm going to change this back to its default, which I believe was 30px. But because this one shows up last, hold on, duplicate property right found. That's fine. This is the one that will take precedence. We don't have to worry about that here. What change did we make here? It used to be 0. And instead, we called it top. So I'll be able to delete this later when I am setting up the lesson for y'all to download so you can have a fresh copy. So I'm just going to make my changes down here. Let me make this one 100 to make sure that it's being listened to. So even though there's a duplicate property, because this top is higher up, it's going to be ignored. And this is the one that it should have. So if sticky is still lower down, it means that we're not having a problem. So we're good in that regard. Change that. No, we can leave that there. So we are back up here. Just wanted to make sure I could leave everything so I could just delete these at the end. Hold on, let me just go back for a second. We added the first thing we did was on comments. We could just recomment. In our fixed class, we added a top property of 50px. And originally, let's just say it was 10. Cool, cool, cool. Then we added a right property of 20%. We're good there. Then we added a top property of 10 right there. Then we added to our absolute a left property of 50 and a top property of 200. Hold on. Okay, sorry for that delay. So now we are at the next step. We've included everything in the absolute class declaration. And the next part of the instructions are asking us to re-add the comments to that section. So let's disappear this section real quick and make the other one up here. So go back into our index.html. And since we're done messing around with these, we can add the comment back. And now I want you to uncomment from this simple float example all the way down to here. This is the section that we're going to take a look at now. Now let's see how this will all disappear, and we'll see how our page looks. And we have what looks like a heading with some text and an image that says float and a longer piece of text and a horizontal line. Let's see what the first assignment or instruction is. It says in the index.html, remove the comments, which we have done. And in the box class declaration. So let's find our box class. Here it is. And we are going to change the float property from right to left. So whatever is labeled box is going to go from left, which it currently is, to right. Now, you know, I could delete this and put my float right there. And the only reason I'm not doing so is just for instructional purposes. But this is somewhat incorrect because it's a duplicate property, but don't worry about that for now. I'm just doing this so I can know what to erase later when I bring this back to 0 or bring it back to its normal setting. It looks like our div class of box is this word float. And now I see where it got its shape. This is just a div with a word in it, but we see this square shape. Looks like it's gotten a margin right of 15 px, a width of 150. We made it into a square with a border radius to curve the edges, background color of that teal color, and padding of EM. Let's just take a look at that real quick. And we're going to mess with it a little bit. You can create shapes, right? So we created this box right here, and you can see where the margin right comes in. That just pushes the text over there to the right from a little bit to the left all the way to the right. The width is just the size. That's gonna change drastically if we remove it. It should only be the shape of what's in it, which is that word float. Everything else is extra. So the height 150 will change drastically if we remove it and only cover the space where content is, and the only content there is the word float. If we remove the width as well, it should push all the way into the right, leaving only the padding, which is 1 EM all the way around. We remove that, we'll just see the word float. And then that last margin is that last bit. So with just those styling properties, we were able to create the effect of this square. That when we bring everything back, we create that illusion. And now that we have added a float right instead of a float left, the box and all of its contents are going to show up over here. And there it is, floating to the right and no longer breaking the, you can see the change here. This element is breaking this text. But when it floats to the right, it allows everything to move in pretty nicely. So that's one way you can mess around with your items to make sure that they play nice together. Again, everything is fighting for space. So it can be a good example to use these kind of layouts. Let's see if it's responsive. I doubt it. Not quite. It's kind of getting harder to read. There's a lot to work to do here first, but it looks pretty good just by default. We're going to close out our inspector tools and move on to the next part. Next, in the cleared class declaration, change the clear property to right. So here's our cleared class. What does it refer to? This text, which is cleared. That's the reason why it, when we had this as float left, let's make this change first. The clear must be in the direction of the element that uses floats. So our float isn't a left anymore, it's a right. And that's what it's asking us to mess with. It wants us to change the property to right, the clear property. So let's change this to right, and I do think we're going to see some problems actually, because it looks pretty good the way it looks now. So adding this might re-add the clear to the paragraph tag, and we might have that spacing we saw before, but I'm not sure. Let's take a look. And that is the case. So be careful with the float and clear property. It takes a lot of practice. I kind of assumed what was going to happen, but that's just because I've worked with this kind of intensely trying to figure it out. I recommend you do the same. But in this case, just floating it to the right fixed our problem, and we don't necessarily want this p tag to be cleared. We kind of want it to wrap around. So I'm going to actually change this back. I'm going to change this one back. This is how it was when we started. And I am going to give this an opposite clear right here. But following our convention, I don't want to add it there. I want to add it down here to ignore it, so I can delete it afterwards. Wonder if that works. Right, much better. Mess around with those two. Try to make them the same, make them different. Remove one, remove the other. It's going to help a lot. The next and final part, which we're not going to spend too much time on because this requires an understanding of this CSS framework, and we haven't gotten into that at all. But Bootstrap has some classes built into the HTML which have column lengths, and they look like this. Hold on. I know what to erase there, what to erase there, I know what to erase there. Excellent. Let's take a look at this. And we're going to re-add our comments. to erase that part of the screen. Now we should look at an empty screen. And we are going to uncomment this pretty gross looking piece of code down here. We see an H2 followed by a bunch of divs and some children, div parent, div children, so 3 sets of 3. And what are we going to see? Some columns that are extending, some columns that are breaking, and one that's clearing, it looks like. And the whole ask here is to mess around with actually the HTML. You can mess around with this too, but really not sure. I would rather you just make all the changes you want, break it as much as you want. I doubt you'll be using this in the early go of it, but it's good to be exposed to it now. So let's just do a little bit of damage and we'll see what happens. I'm changing this one to 4. See if any change whatsoever happens to that middle row. We saw a change there. Actually fits better now. Change that back to 8. I'm going to change this one to 1. I don't think we're going to see much. It's going to get back to its original shape. Yeah, no change. Let's change this one to 2. This one became smaller. So fool around with that. I'm sure that you'll be able to make some sense of it. It's not the most commonly used thing anymore. There's lots of easier ways to do this, but that's just one way to use a column framework to build your website, but you would have to have a clear understanding of how big those columns are and how many you would need, and it's actually a lot of extra work. But change a couple of things to see how it works. So we have in this lesson gone over a tiny bit of Bootstrap, which is the final thing we did. Things that are positioned absolute, fixed, and sticky, which is a whole class in of itself, and I will bring it up later on in our project, but we're going to be mostly using Flexbox, and we'll only rely on absolute settings when we need to. And then finally, regular floating and clearing, which again has been improved upon, is no longer used as often, but it's still very important to know. So if you're using if you're working with legacy code, or if you're just trying to understand the way that modern web development has evolved from these technologies to newer ones. And that wraps it up for this foray into CSS. In the next lesson, we're going to be getting into our first project where we're going to be building a website using the most modern technology and most modern / simplest that we can do at this point. And we'll see how we can use the things that we've learned in the first 7 lessons to make something that is cohesive. So I'll see you in the next one.